Hey everyone, welcome to Midnight Mystic Stories. I noticed a lot of you who are watching and enjoying the content aren't subscribed yet. If you love spine-chilling stories, creepy encounters, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It really helps the channel grow and helps us keep bringing more of the content you love. And be sure to comment below where you are tuning in from. Thank you and enjoy the video. I used to think I was pretty street smart. Grew up in a city, knew how to spot a scam, knew how to walk with confidence, all that jazz. Craigslist was just another tool, a way to find deals, sell old stuff, nothing to be afraid of. I was so wrong. It started with an apartment listing. I was fresh out of college, moving to a new city for a job, and the rental market was insane. Everything was overpriced and tiny. Then I saw it, a beautiful, spacious one-bedroom in a great neighborhood, listed for way less than anything else I'd seen. The photos looked legit, the description was normal, and the landlord, David, seemed friendly enough in his emails. Too good to be true, right? I chose to ignore that nagging voice in my head. We set up a viewing. David said he was out of town, but would have his property manager, Sarah, meet me with the keys. I drove to the address, a charming brownstone on a tree-lined street. Sarah was already there, waiting on the steps. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and seemed a little nervous. "David sends his apologies, he couldn't be here," she said, fumbling with the keys. "He's really busy with work." We went inside, and the apartment was even better than the pictures. High ceilings, hardwood floors, a modern kitchen. It was perfect. The only weird thing was that Sarah seemed really eager to get out of there. She rushed me through the tour, barely answering my questions, and kept glancing at her watch. "So, what do you think?" she asked, practically pushing me towards the door. "I love it," I said. "I want to apply." She visibly relaxed. "Great. David handles all the applications online. I'll send you his email." I thanked her and left, feeling like I'd just won the lottery. I emailed David that night, expressing my interest and asking about the application process. He responded quickly, saying he was thrilled I liked the place and that he just needed a few things from me to pre-qualify me before he sent the official application. He asked for a copy of my driver's license, my social security number, and proof of income. That's when the alarm bells started going off. Social security number? For a pre-qualification? I'd applied for apartments before, and no one had ever asked for that up front. But I was so caught up in the excitement of finding the perfect place, I almost dismissed it. Almost. Instead, I decided to do a little digging. I Googled David's name and the address of the apartment. Nothing came up. Then I searched for Sarah's name. Still nothing. It was like they didn't exist. I tried reverse image, searching the photos from the Craigslist ad. Bingo! The photos were stolen from a real estate website in a completely different city. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a bad deal, it was a scam. They were trying to steal my identity. I immediately stopped all communication with David and Sarah, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced they knew where I lived. A few days later, I got a strange email. It was from an unknown address, and the subject line was just a string of random characters. The body of the email contained a single sentence: "We know where you park your car." I panicked. How could they know that? I hadn't told them anything about my car or where I lived. The only explanation was that they had been watching me, tracking me. I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They advised me to be careful and report anything suspicious. I was terrified. I changed my phone number, deactivated my social media accounts, and started staying with a friend. I felt like I was living in a movie, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for something bad to happen. Weeks went by, and nothing did. Eventually, the fear started to fade, but the experience had changed me. I no longer trusted easily, and I was much more cautious about sharing personal information online. I learned the hard way that the anonymity of the internet can be a dangerous thing, and that not everyone is who they say they are. Craigslist, for me, became a symbol of that naivete. It was a reminder that even seemingly harmless platforms can be used for malicious purposes. I still use the internet, of course, but I approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism and a much stronger sense of self-preservation. I realized I was not as street smart as I thought, and that criminals are lurking everywhere, ready to target anyone. I learned never to underestimate people, because you never know what people are capable of. I learned a valuable lesson that day about trusting my gut, and more importantly, about the dark side lurking behind those seemingly innocent Craigslist ads. This happened back in 2010, when I was fresh out of high school and desperate for cash. I needed to fix my beat-up Honda Civic, and the local mechanic quoted me a price that made my stomach drop. Craigslist seemed like the perfect place to find a quick, under-the-table gig to make some extra money. I scrolled through the gig section, bypassing the obvious scams and shady offers, until I came across an ad that seemed legit enough. Labor needed for light demolition work. $15 per hour, cash paid daily. Must be able to lift heavy objects. Call Mark. The pay was decent, and I was young and strong, so I figured why not? I called the number, and a gruff voice answered. Mark, as he introduced himself, told me to meet him at a specific address the next morning at 7 a.m. He explained that it was an old warehouse they were tearing down, and he needed someone to help with the grunt work. The address was in a less than desirable part of town, an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. When I arrived, I found a dilapidated warehouse surrounded by overgrown weeds and a chain-link fence. Mark was waiting for me, a burly man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He looked me up and down, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "You're the kid from the ad?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to sound confident despite the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. He led me inside the warehouse, which was even more rundown than it appeared from the outside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The only light came from a few grimy windows and the open doorway. Inside, there were two other men, both equally intimidating in appearance. Mark introduced them as Tony and Frank. They barely acknowledged me, just nodded curtly. Mark handed me a sledgehammer and a pair of worn-out work gloves. "All right, kid," he said. "Start swinging. We need to clear this place out." For the first few hours, the work was as expected, back-breaking and monotonous. I was tasked with smashing old furniture, tearing down drywall, and hauling debris to a dumpster outside. Mark and the other two men worked alongside me, but there was a strange undercurrent to the whole situation. They barely spoke to each other, and their eyes constantly darted around the warehouse, as if they were expecting something to happen. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Mark started barking orders at me, his voice growing more aggressive. He seemed agitated, pacing back and forth and muttering under his breath. I tried to ignore it and focus on the work, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. Around mid-afternoon, Mark called us all over. "All right, listen up," he said, his eyes narrowed. "We need to get this done faster. We're running behind schedule." He then pointed to a section of the warehouse I hadn't seen before, a dark and secluded corner hidden behind a pile of debris. "There's some stuff back there that needs to be taken care of. Go clear it out." I hesitated. The area he was pointing to was shrouded in shadows, and the thought of venturing back there made my skin crawl. But I needed the money, and I didn't want to provoke Mark further. "All right," I said, trying to sound brave. "I'll do it." I grabbed my sledgehammer and cautiously made my way towards the dark corner. As I got closer, the air grew colder, and the smell of decay intensified. I pushed aside the pile of debris and peered into the shadows. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the corner, chained to the wall, were several large metal cages. Inside the cages were animals. Not just any animals, but emaciated, terrified dogs. They were whimpering and cowering in the corners of their cages, their ribs protruding through their matted fur. I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was seeing. "What the hell is this?" I muttered to myself. That's when I heard Mark's voice behind me. "Found something interesting, kid?" I turned around to see Mark standing there, a sinister grin on his face. Tony and Frank were behind him, blocking the exit. "What are you doing with these dogs?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger and fear. Mark chuckled. "Let's just say they're not here for their health. We use them for certain activities." He then proceeded to describe in graphic detail what those activities entailed. I won't repeat it here, but it was the most disturbing and depraved thing I had ever heard. I was horrified and disgusted, but I also knew that I was in serious danger. These men were not just running an illegal dog-fighting ring. They were capable of anything. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was trapped. Mark and his cronies were blocking the only exit, and I was no match for them in a fight. I tried to think of a plan, but my mind was racing. "I don't want any part of this," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm leaving." Mark laughed. "You know too much now, kid. You're not going anywhere." He gestured to Tony and Frank, who started moving towards me. I knew this was it. I was about to become another victim of these depraved monsters. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the dogs in the cages, a large, scruffy-looking mutt, started barking furiously. It was as if it sensed the danger I was in and was trying to warn me. The barking startled Mark and his men, giving me a split-second opportunity. I swung my sledgehammer with all my might, hitting Tony square in the face. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Frank lunged at me, but I dodged him and ran towards the exit. Mark was right behind me, yelling and cursing. I burst out of the warehouse and into the sunlight, running as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind woman, listened to my story and drove me to the nearest police station. I told the police everything, and they immediately launched an investigation. They raided the warehouse and arrested Mark and his accomplices. They also rescued the dogs, who were taken to a local animal shelter. I testified against Mark and his men in court, and they were eventually convicted of animal cruelty, illegal dogfighting, and assault. I was relieved that they were brought to justice, but the experience left me deeply scarred. I couldn't sleep for weeks, haunted by the images of the terrified dogs and the depraved acts of their captors. I learned a valuable lesson that day about trusting my gut, and more importantly, about the dark side lurking behind those seemingly innocent Craigslist ads. From then on, I stuck to legitimate job sources, even if it meant making less money. It simply wasn't worth the risk. That day changed me. I became more aware of the cruelty that exists in the world, and I vowed to do what I could to help those who are vulnerable and defenseless. It also taught me the importance of trusting my instincts, because sometimes a gut feeling is the only warning you get before it's too late. And I never, ever used Craigslist again. The feeling of danger and dread that comes with it is simply not worth the bargain. I learned a valuable lesson that day about trusting my gut, and more importantly, about the dark side lurking behind those seemingly innocent Craigslist ads. This happened back in 2010, when I was fresh out of high school and desperate for cash. I needed to fix my beat-up Honda Civic, and the local mechanic quoted me a price that made my stomach drop. Craigslist seemed like the perfect place to find a quick, under-the-table gig to make some extra money. I scrolled through the gig section, bypassing the obvious scams and shady offers, until I came across an ad that seemed legit enough. Labor needed for light demolition work. $15 per hour, cash paid daily. Must be able to lift heavy objects. Call Mark. The pay was decent, and I was young and strong, so I figured why not. I called the number, and a gruff voice answered. Mark, as he introduced himself, told me to meet him at a specific address the next morning at 7 a.m. He explained that it was an old warehouse they were tearing down, and he needed someone to help with the grunt work. The address was in a less than desirable part of town, an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. When I arrived, I found a dilapidated warehouse surrounded by overgrown weeds and a chain-link fence. Mark was waiting for me, a burly man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He looked me up and down, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "You're the kid from the ad?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to sound confident despite the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. He led me inside the warehouse, which was even more rundown than it appeared from the outside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The only light came from a few grimy windows and the open doorway. Inside, there were two other men, both equally intimidating in appearance. Mark introduced them as Tony and Frank. They barely acknowledged me, just nodded curtly. Mark handed me a sledgehammer and a pair of worn-out work gloves. "All right, kid," he said. "Start swinging. We need to clear this place out." For the first few hours, the work was as expected, back-breaking and monotonous. I was tasked with smashing old furniture, tearing down drywall, and hauling debris to a dumpster outside. Mark and the other two men worked alongside me, but there was a strange undercurrent to the whole situation. They barely spoke to each other, and their eyes constantly darted around the warehouse, as if they were expecting something to happen. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Mark started barking orders at me, his voice growing more aggressive. He seemed agitated, pacing back and forth and muttering under his breath. I tried to ignore it and focus on the work, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. Around mid-afternoon, Mark called us all over. "All right, listen up," he said, his eyes narrowed. "We need to get this done faster. We're running behind schedule." He then pointed to a section of the warehouse I hadn't seen before, a dark and secluded corner hidden behind a pile of debris. "There's some stuff back there that needs to be taken care of. Go clear it out." I hesitated. The area he was pointing to was shrouded in shadows, and the thought of venturing back there made my skin crawl. But I needed the money, and I didn't want to provoke Mark further. "All right," I said, trying to sound brave. "I'll do it." I grabbed my sledgehammer and cautiously made my way towards the dark corner. As I got closer, the air grew colder, and the smell of decay intensified. I pushed aside the pile of debris and peered into the shadows. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the corner, chained to the wall, were several large metal cages. Inside the cages were animals. Not just any animals, but emaciated, terrified dogs. They were whimpering and cowering in the corners of their cages, their ribs protruding through their matted fur. I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what I was seeing. "What the hell is this?" I muttered to myself. That's when I heard Mark's voice behind me. "Found something interesting, kid?" I turned around to see Mark standing there, a sinister grin on his face. Tony and Frank were behind him, blocking the exit. "What are you doing with these dogs?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger and fear. Mark chuckled. "Let's just say they're not here for their health. We use them for certain activities." He then proceeded to describe in graphic detail what those activities entailed. I won't repeat it here, but it was the most disturbing and depraved thing I had ever heard. I was horrified and disgusted, but I also knew that I was in serious danger. These men were not just running an illegal dog-fighting ring. They were capable of anything. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was trapped. Mark and his cronies were blocking the only exit, and I was no match for them in a fight. I tried to think of a plan, but my mind was racing. "I don't want any part of this," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm leaving." Mark laughed. "You know too much now, kid. You're not going anywhere." He gestured to Tony and Frank, who started moving towards me. I knew this was it. I was about to become another victim of these depraved monsters. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the dogs in the cages, a large, scruffy-looking mutt, started barking furiously. It was as if it sensed the danger I was in and was trying to warn me. The barking startled Mark and his men, giving me a split-second opportunity. I swung my sledgehammer with all my might, hitting Tony square in the face. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Frank lunged at me, but I dodged him and ran towards the exit. Mark was right behind me, yelling and cursing. I burst out of the warehouse and into the sunlight, running as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind woman, listened to my story and drove me to the nearest police station. I told the police everything, and they immediately launched an investigation. They raided the warehouse and arrested Mark and his accomplices. They also rescued the dogs, who were taken to a local animal shelter. I testified against Mark and his men in court, and they were eventually convicted of animal cruelty, illegal dogfighting, and assault. I was relieved that they were brought to justice, but the experience left me deeply scarred. I couldn't sleep for weeks, haunted by the images of the terrified dogs and the depraved acts of their captors. I learned a valuable lesson that day about trusting my gut, and more importantly, about the dark side lurking behind those seemingly innocent Craigslist ads. From then on, I stuck to legitimate job sources, even if it meant making less money. It simply wasn't worth the risk. That day changed me. I became more aware of the cruelty that exists in the world, and I vowed to do what I could to help those who are vulnerable and defenseless. It also taught me the importance of trusting my instincts, because sometimes a gut feeling is the only warning you get before it's too late. And I never, ever used Craigslist again. The feeling of danger and dread that comes with it is simply not worth the bargain. I used to think those Craigslist horror stories were made up, just internet legends, to scare gullible people. I'd scroll past them on forums, rolling my eyes. Yeah, right, I'd think. Like anyone would actually fall for that. I was so wrong. So wrong. It started with a damn futon. I was moving into my first real apartment after years of dorm rooms and shared houses, and I was broke. Like, ramen for dinner every night broke. Furniture was a luxury I couldn't afford, so Craigslist was my go-to. I found a futon that looked decent enough in the pictures. Clean, modern, and most importantly, cheap. The ad was simple. Futon for sale. Great condition. $50. No phone number, just an email address. I emailed the seller, and they responded quickly. A guy named Mark said I could pick it up the next day. He gave me an address in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. A little rundown, but not particularly scary. The next day, I drove over, my little hatchback practically empty, ready to haul this futon back to my new place. The address led me to a small, unassuming house with a chain-link fence around the yard. I parked on the street and walked up to the gate, feeling a little nervous. There was something off about the place, a kind of rundown, forgotten feeling. I called Mark's name a couple of times, and after a minute, the front door creaked open. A man stepped out. He was tall and thin, with dark, greasy hair and a nervous look in his eyes. He didn't look like a Mark to me, but who am I to judge? "You here for the futon?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah, I'm my name," I replied. "Nice to meet you." He didn't smile or offer a handshake, just nodded and gestured for me to follow him. We walked around the side of the house, and there it was, the futon, leaning against the back wall. It looked even better in person than it did in the pictures. "Looks great," I said, relieved. "So, $50, right?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the yard. "Yeah, 50. But could you maybe do me a favor first?" That's when the red flags started popping up like fireworks. My gut clenched, and I instantly regretted coming here. "What kind of favor?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling like stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. "It's just, I need some help moving something inside. It's really heavy, and I can't do it alone." I took a step back. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "I just came for the futon." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "It'll just take a minute," he said, his voice urgent. "Please, I'll give you a discount on the futon." I tried to pull away, but he held on tight. Panic started to set in. I knew I had to get out of there fast. I don't have time," I stammered. "I have to go." I yanked my arm free and turned to run back to my car. He didn't try to stop me, but as I ran, I heard him yell something after me. "You'll be back." I didn't look back. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely steer. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in a familiar part of town. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart still pounding in my chest. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. I could have just written it off. But when I got home, I noticed something odd. There was something on my car that I had never seen before. It was a white piece of paper that had been taped to my tire, and it read, "She wants to say hi, and I don't even have a girlfriend." I drove straight to the police station and reported the incident, but they couldn't do much without more information. They took down my statement and advised me to be careful. I didn't sleep well for weeks. I kept having nightmares about that man, about that house, about whatever he wanted me to move inside. I deleted my Craigslist account and vowed never to use it again. A week later, I went out to my car and saw the same note taped to the tire. But this time it said, "She is very angry now. The worst part is I sold the car right after, but the police said it was a waste to investigate since I was just trying to be scared." And you won't believe it. 3 months later, I got a call from the police saying the guy from Craigslist was arrested. I was not one of the victims, but he was found to be a serial killer of 13 women. To this day, I get shivers thinking about what could have happened if I had agreed to help him. Now, whenever I see those Craigslist horror stories online, I don't roll my eyes anymore. I know they're not all made up, because I almost became one myself. I still go over this day to day, and it still bothers me a lot. Now every time I'm out, I get anxiety over every little thing, because I'm afraid of what could happen. I never looked at Craigslist the same. I avoid it at all costs now. I'm just lucky to be here and get the chance to tell the story. Okay, so picture this. It's 2008. The housing market is collapsing, and I'm fresh out of a bad breakup and desperate to leave the apartment I shared with my ex. I needed a place like yesterday, but my credit was shot, and I barely had 2 nickels to rub together. Naturally, I turned to Craigslist. Mistake number 1, I know. But back then, it felt like the only option. I scrolled through endless listings, dodging scams and questionable roommate situations until I found one that seemed okay. A small studio apartment in a slightly rundown part of town, but the rent was unbelievably cheap. The ad was short and to the point. Studio apartment for rent. $400 per month. Utilities included. Call name and number. No photos. Red flag number 1, obviously, but desperate times, right? I called the number, and a man answered. His voice was kind of gravelly and low, and he seemed a little off, but he said his name was Mr. Abernathy, and he was the landlord. He told me the apartment was available immediately and that I could come see it the next day. We met at the apartment building, which was even more rundown in person. The building reeked of stale cigarettes and something vaguely moldy. Mr. Abernathy was a tall, Thin man with greasy hair and a nervous demeanor. He kept glancing around like he was afraid someone was watching us. The apartment itself was small, barely bigger than a closet. The walls were stained, the carpet was threadbare, and the only window was covered with the heavy, tattered curtain. But for $400, I figure I could make it work at MR. Abernathy handed me a lease agreement, which was surprisingly detailed for such a cheap place. I skimmed it quickly, noticing a few odd clauses about noise restrictions and guest limitations, but I was so eager to get out of my ex's place that I didn't pay much attention. I signed it, handed over the first month's rent and security deposit in cash, red flag number 2, and got the keys that I should have trusted my instincts when Mr. Abernathy insisted on doing a walkthrough of the apartment with me one last time before leaving. He lingered, touching the walls, opening and closing the cabinets, and generally making me feel uncomfortable. He kept making small talk, asking about my job, my hobbies, my personal life. I tried to be polite but brief, wanting him to leave so I could finally settle in. Finally, he left, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I spent the next few days cleaning and unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. But the unsettling feeling I had during the initial walkthrough never really went away. The first night, I had trouble sleeping. The building was eerily quiet, and I kept hearing strange noises, creaks, groans, and whispers that seemed to come from the walls. I chalked it up to the old building settling and tried to ignore it, but the noises persisted, growing louder and more frequent each night. I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the apartment. One night, I woke up to find the heavy curtain over the window slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. I dismissed it as sleepwalking, but the next night, it happened again. Then, things started disappearing. Small things at first, a pen, a sock, a roll of tape. I figured I was just misplacing them, but then my keys went missing. I tore the apartment apart looking for them, but they were nowhere to be found. I had to change the locks, which cost me a fortune that I started to get really paranoid. I felt like I was being watched constantly. I would catch glimpses of shadows out of a corner of my eye, and I would hear footsteps outside my door when no one was there. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. One afternoon, I came home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart leaped into my throat. I cautiously pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. Drawers were open, clothes were scattered everywhere, and furniture was overturned. It looked like someone had ransacked the place. I called the police, who came and took a report. They said it looked like a robbery, but nothing of value was missing. They dusted for fingerprints, but they didn't find anything. That I was terrified. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random break-in. It felt personal, like someone was trying to scare me. That I decided to do some digging into Mr. Abernathy. I went online and searched his name, but I couldn't find anything. Then, I went to the county records office and looked up the property ownership information for the apartment building. The name on the deed wasn't Abernathy. It was something else entirely, and there was a long list of past owners, dating back to the early 1900s. As I scrolled through the list, I noticed something strange. Every few years, a name would appear, followed by a death date shortly after, and the cause of death was always listed as unknown or accidental. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had a feeling I knew what was happening. I went back to the apartment, determined to get out of there as soon as possible. I packed my bags, called a moving company, and waited for them to arrive. While I was waiting, I decided to take one last look around the apartment. I went into the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet. Inside, I found a small, dusty box. That I opened the box and gasped. Inside were my missing keys, along with several other sets of keys, all labeled with different apartment numbers. And beneath the keys was a stack of old photographs. The photos were of young women, all living in the apartment I was currently renting. And on the back of each photo was a date, written in shaky handwriting. The dates corresponded to the death dates I had seen in the county records. That I knew then that Mr. Abernathy wasn't the landlord. He was something much worse, and he had been watching me the entire time that I ran out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. I didn't stop running until I was miles away. That I never went back. That I later found out that Mr. Abernathy was a con man and possibly a serial killer. He preyed on vulnerable women, lured them into cheap apartments, and then, well, I don't want to think about it. That I learned a valuable lesson from that experience. Trust your instincts, especially when dealing with Craigslist. If something feels too good to be true, it probably is. And never, ever ignore the red flags. Now I pay triple the rent, but at least I sleep at night. Okay, so listen up, because I need to tell someone about this. I need to warn people, especially those of you who are like I was, young, broke, and trying to make it in a new city. Don't be stupid like I was. Don't trust Craigslist. It started like this. I moved to Portland without a plan. I had a little money saved, enough for a month's rent on a cheap room. But that was it. I needed a job, and I needed one fast. I was hitting all the usual job boards, but then I saw this ad on Craigslist that seemed perfect. Live-in assistant for private collector, room, board, and generous stipend. Must be discreet and detail-oriented. Okay, red flag number 1. Generous stipend. What kind of collector needs a live-in assistant and pays that well? But I was desperate, and the ad was so normal-sounding. No weird language, no creepy vibes. Just a straightforward job posting. I emailed, attached my resume, and honestly didn't expect to hear back. But I did. A guy named Mr. Silas called me the next day. He had this smooth, almost too calm voice. He explained that he was a collector of, well, he was vague. He said he collected unique artifacts and needed someone to help him catalog and maintain them. He offered me an interview at his house the following afternoon. Against my better judgment, I went. The house was way out in the suburbs, a huge, Gothic-looking mansion surrounded by woods. It was the kind of place that looks like it should be in a movie, not in a quiet residential neighborhood. The gate was open, so I drove up the long, winding driveway. Mr. Silas met me at the door. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and piercing blue eyes. He was dressed in a tailored suit, which seemed odd for someone who supposedly spent his days dusting antiques. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The inside of the house was even weirder than the outside. It was filled with stuff. Not just antiques, but weird, unsettling objects. Tribal masks, taxidermied animals with disturbing expressions, ancient weapons, and rows upon rows of dusty books. The air smelled like old paper and something else, something metallic and faintly rotten. The interview was strange. Mr. Silas didn't ask about my skills or experience. He just asked about my loyalty, my discretion, and whether I was comfortable with unconventional arrangements. I tried to play it cool, to act like I wasn't completely freaked out. He showed me the room where I would be staying, a small, sparsely furnished space in the basement. It was damp and smelled like mildew. Despite all the warning signs, I took the job. I told myself it was temporary, that I would find something better as soon as I could. But I needed the money, and I needed a place to stay. The first few weeks were unsettling but manageable. My job mostly consisted of dusting, organizing, and running errands. Mr. Silas was always polite but distant. He rarely spoke to me directly, usually leaving instructions in notes or through a strange intercom system. But then things started to get weird. I began to notice things were moved. A book out of place, a mask facing a different direction. I thought I was imagining it at first, but then I started finding things hidden. In a drawer, I found a small, antique music box that played a haunting melody. Inside, there was a lock of hair, tied with a faded ribbon. In the attic, I discovered a collection of old photographs, all portraits of young women. Their eyes were scratched out. And then there was the basement. Mr. Silas had strictly forbidden me from going into the basement, but one day, I couldn't resist. I waited until I knew he was out of the house and crept down the creaky stairs. The basement was dark and damp, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of decay. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, there was a large wooden table. Strapped to the table was a woman. She was unconscious, her eyes wide and unseeing. She was naked, and her body was covered in strange symbols. I screamed. I stumbled back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached the main road. I called the police, but they didn't believe me. They said I was hysterical, that I was probably on drugs. They went to the house to investigate, but Mr. Silas had vanished. The house was empty, stripped bare. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The police closed the case, saying it was a hoax. But I know what I saw. I know that woman was real. I'm telling you this because I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. Craigslist can seem like a lifeline when you're down on your luck, but it's also a haven for predators. Please be careful. Don't trust strangers. Don't ignore the red flags. And for God's sake, stay away from Craigslist jobs that seem too good to be true. They probably are. Okay, so this happened to me a few years ago, and even now, I get chills thinking about it. I was fresh out of college, dead broke, and desperately trying to find an apartment in a city where even the roaches were charging premium rent. Craigslist was my only hope. I know. Red flags everywhere. But I was young and naive and really needed a place to live. I saw this ad that seemed almost too good to be true. Spacious room for rent in quiet neighborhood. Utilities included. $600 per month. In that area, $600 was basically a steal. The pictures looked decent, clean, bright, and furnished. I emailed the poster immediately, and within an hour, I got a response from a guy named Mark. He seemed normal enough in the emails. Polite, responsive, answered all my questions. He said he was a young professional who worked from home and was looking for a responsible roommate. We scheduled a viewing for the next day. I was cautiously optimistic. The apartment was in an older building, a little run down, but the neighborhood was actually pretty nice. When Mark opened the door, I was immediately relieved. He was about my age, maybe a little older, clean-cut, and seemed friendly enough. He gave me a tour of the place, and the room was exactly as advertised, spacious, clean, and had its own private bathroom. The rest of the apartment was tidy, if a little sparsely decorated. We talked for a while, and he seemed really normal. He asked about my job, my hobbies, my background. I told him I was a recent grad, working part-time at a coffee shop while I looked for something more permanent. He seemed genuinely interested. He said he was a software developer and mostly kept to himself. Everything felt right, almost too right. I chalked it up to luck. I told him I was interested in taking the room, and he seemed pleased. He said he needed to do a quick background check, which seemed reasonable, and asked for my full name, date of birth, and social security number. That's where the alarm bells should have started ringing. But like an idiot, I gave it to him. I know, I'm an idiot. I was so desperate, and he seemed so normal. He said he would let me know within a day or two. I left feeling like I'd finally caught a break. The next day, I got an email from Mark saying that everything checked out, and he was happy to have me as a roommate. He asked me to bring the first month's rent and a security deposit in cash when I moved in, which I thought was a little weird, but I was so excited I didn't question it. He said he'd be home on Saturday morning to let me in. Saturday morning rolled around, and I packed all my belongings into my friend's car and drove to the apartment. I was nervous but excited. This was finally my own place. I texted Mark when I arrived, and he replied immediately, saying he'd be right down. A few minutes later, the front door opened, but it wasn't Mark. It was a different guy, older, heavier, with a creepy smile on his face. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. I froze, clutching my bag of cash. "Mark isn't here," he finally said, his voice gravelly. "But he told me you were coming." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. He just chuckled. "Let's just say I'm a friend. Come on in." I didn't move. I knew something was terribly wrong. "Where's Mark?" I repeated, my voice stronger this time. He shrugged. He had to leave town. Something came up. "But don't worry, I'll take good care of you." I turned and ran. I didn't even grab my stuff from my friend's car. I just ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main street. I called my friend, hysterical, and told him to get out of there. We went straight to the police station. They took my statement, but because I had willingly given Mark my information and agreed to rent the room, there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd investigate, but I never heard back from them. I later found out that the photos Mark used in his ad were stolen from someone else's online profile. He was a complete catfish, the guy who answered the door that day. I don't even want to think about what he was planning to do. I lost the security deposit, which sucked, but it was a small price to pay compared to what could have happened. I ended up finding a room in a shared house through a reputable agency, and I've never used Craigslist for anything housing-related since. The experience shook me to my core. It taught me a valuable lesson about trusting strangers and the dangers of desperation. I'm still cautious about sharing personal information online, and I always trust my gut. Craigslist might be a good place to find a used couch, but it's definitely not the place to find a safe place to live. Okay, so I needed a new roommate. Desperately. My old roommate, Mark, decided to take a sudden vow of silence and move to a monastery in Nepal. Seriously. Left me high and dry 3 weeks before rent was due. Craigslist was my only hope. I scrolled through dozens of profiles. People wanting to practice their flugelhorn at 3 a.m. Conspiracy theorists needing a safe space. You name it. Then I saw the ad that seemed almost normal. Looking for roommate in quiet, clean apartment. Male or female, non-smoker, must be respectful of privacy. $700 per month plus utilities. Email address. The photos showed a decently furnished living room and a tidy-looking bedroom. The email was generic, but not creepy. I emailed back, expressing my interest and asking for a viewing. The reply came quickly. Come by tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Apartment 3B. Name is David. The apartment building was in a slightly run-down part of town, but nothing too alarming. Still, as I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The hallway was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mothballs. I knocked on the door of 3B. A man answered the door. He was tall, thin, and pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He had a polite, almost shy smile. "You must be my name," he said. Come in, come in." The apartment was eerily silent. The photos online hadn't lied. It was clean and tidy, almost sterile. There were no personal touches, no pictures on the walls, no books on the shelves. It felt more like a stage model apartment than someone's actual home. David showed me around, pointing out the kitchen, the bathroom, and the spare bedroom that would be mine. He answered my questions about utilities and lease agreements calmly and efficiently. He seemed perfect. Too perfect. That's when the little alarms started going off in my head. The moment I knew something was wrong was when he showed me the living room. It was furnished with a couch, a coffee table, and a large bookshelf. On the bookshelf were rows and rows of identical, unmarked black notebooks. I mean hundreds of them. They filled the entire shelf. "What are those?" I asked, try to sound casual. David's smile faltered for a split second. "Those are my journals," he said. "I like to write down my thoughts." "Wow, you must have a lot of thoughts," I replied, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't laugh. He just stared at the notebooks with a strange intensity. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." He quickly steered me away from the bookshelf and towards the window, pointing out the lovely view of the alleyway below. But I couldn't shake the image of those endless black notebooks. It felt like something out of a horror movie. I made an excuse about needing to think about it and left as quickly as I could. As soon as I was outside, I called my best friend Sarah. "Dude, you will not believe this," I said, breathlessly recounting the entire experience. The guy was super weird, and he had hundreds of identical black notebooks on his bookshelf, like a serial killer amount of notebooks. Sarah laughed. "Maybe he's just a really dedicated writer," she said. "No, you don't understand," I insisted. It was the way he looked at them, like they were precious to him, and the apartment was so sterile. No personality at all. It was creepy. I spent the next few days Googling serial killer notebooks and creepy roommate Craigslist stories. I found plenty of cautionary tales, but nothing that specifically matched my experience. Still, my gut was screaming at me to stay away. Then, a week later, I saw a missing person poster taped to a lamppost near my apartment. It was a picture of a young woman with a bright smile and long brown hair. The caption read, "Missing, Emily Carter. Last seen in the vicinity of David's address on date." My blood ran cold. I recognized the date. It was the day before I went to view the apartment. I looked closer at the poster. There was a detail that I hadn't noticed at first. Emily Carter was a writer. I went straight to the police. I told them everything about David, the apartment, the notebooks, the missing woman. They took my statement seriously, but they couldn't do anything without more evidence. A few days later, I saw another missing person poster, this time for a young man. The location where he was last seen was near David's apartment. Occupation, aspiring writer. That was it. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and wait for the police to build a case. I felt like I was the only one who knew the truth about David, and I had to protect other potential victims. I decided to create a fake Craigslist ad, posing as a young writer looking for a mentor. I used a burner email account and a fake name. I described myself as eager to learn and passionate about writing. I mentioned that I was looking for someone with experience and a quiet place to work. Within hours, I received a reply from David. He was interested in meeting me and offered to share his writing techniques with me. He invited me to his apartment the following evening. I knew it was incredibly risky, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only one who could stop him. I went to the police again and told them my plan. They were hesitant but agreed to stake out the apartment building while I was inside. The next evening, I walked back up those 3 flights of stairs, my hands trembling. I knocked on the door of 3B. David answered with that same polite, almost shy smile. "Come in. Fake name," he said. "I've been expecting you." I took a deep breath and stepped inside, praying that I was doing the right thing. The apartment was exactly as I remembered it, eerily silent and sterile. David led me to the living room and gestured towards the bookshelf. "I understand you're interested in my writing," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Perhaps you'd like to take a look at my journals?" He gestured towards the rows and rows of identical black notebooks. I forced myself to walk closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached out to touch one of the notebooks, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the spine of one of the notebooks, barely visible in the dim light, was a name: Emily Carter. That's when the police burst through the door. David didn't resist. He just stood there, smiling serenely as they handcuffed him and led him away. The police searched the apartment thoroughly. They found evidence linking David to the missing writers, including their personal belongings and handwritten manuscripts hidden within the black notebooks. It turned out that David was a deeply disturbed individual who preyed on aspiring writers. He lured them to his apartment with the promise of mentorship, then murdered them and stole their work, adding their stories to his macabre collection of journals. I still have nightmares about those notebooks, about the silence of that apartment, about the look in David's eyes. But I also know that I did the right thing. I helped bring a monster to justice and potentially saved other lives. I'll never use Craigslist for finding a roommate again. Never. Okay, so I needed a new car, like yesterday. My old beater finally gave up the ghost, and I had a new job lined up that required a reliable commute. I was scraping the bottom of the barrel financially, so dealerships were out of the question. That left me with Craigslist. I know. Craigslist cars are a gamble, but I figured I could find something decent if I was careful. I spent days scouring the listings, filtering by price, year, and mileage, trying to find something that didn't scream impending doom. Finally, I found it. A 2010 Honda Civic, advertised as well-maintained, with relatively low miles for its age. The pictures looked good, clean interior, no obvious dents or rust. The price was suspiciously low, but the ad mentioned the owner was moving out of state and needed to sell it quickly. Red flag, sure, but I was running out of time and options. I emailed the seller, a guy named Mark, and we set up a time to meet the next day. He seemed normal enough over email, responsive and polite. We agreed to meet at a gas station near my apartment, a public place, which eased my anxieties a little. The next day, I showed up at the gas station, slightly nervous, but cautiously optimistic. Mark was already there, waiting beside the Civic. The car looked even better in person than it did in the pictures. Clean, shiny, no obvious issues. Mark was a young guy, maybe late 20s, dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt. He seemed friendly and straightforward, nothing immediately off-putting. We chatted for a few minutes while I gave the car a quick once-over. The tires looked good, the paint was in decent condition, and the interior was surprisingly clean. I started to think I might have actually found a diamond in the rough. I asked Mark if I could take it for a test drive, and he readily agreed. I hopped in the driver's seat, and everything felt normal. The engine started smoothly, the steering was responsive, and the brakes felt solid. I drove around the block, listening for any unusual noises, but everything seemed fine. I even took it on a short stretch of highway to test the acceleration, and it performed well. When I got back to the gas station, I was pretty much sold. This car seemed like a steal. I told Mark I was interested in buying it, and we started to discuss the price. He was firm on the listed price, which was still well below market value, but I didn't argue. I was just relieved to have found a reliable car within my budget. We agreed to meet the next day to finalize the paperwork and exchange the cash for the title. He said he had all the documents ready to go and that we could meet at his place to sign everything. This is the moment I knew something was wrong. Up until that point, everything had seemed almost too good to be true, but meeting at his place felt like a step too far. I had this sudden, visceral feeling of unease, like I was walking into a trap. The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but my gut was screaming at me to back away. I hesitated for a moment, trying to come up with a polite way to decline. Actually, I stammered. Would it be possible to meet somewhere else? Like, maybe at a coffee shop or a police station parking lot. Just for safety, you know. Mark's demeanor changed instantly. The friendly smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard look. He stared at me for a few seconds without saying a word, his eyes piercing and intense. "What's wrong?" he finally said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't you trust me?" I felt a shiver run down my spine. "It's not that," I said, trying to sound calm. "I just prefer to do these kinds of transactions in a public place." "Look," he said, stepping closer. "I'm trying to make this easy for you. I have all the documents at my place, and I don't have time to run around meeting you all over town. If you want the car, you meet me at my place. If not, fine. I'm sure someone else will. He turned and started walking back towards the Civic, his back to me. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to just walk away, trust my instincts, and forget the whole thing. But another part of me was desperate for the car, and the thought of going back to square one was unbearable. Against my better judgment, I decided to meet him at his place. I told myself I was being overly cautious, that he was just in a hurry, and that I could always leave if things felt too weird. We exchanged addresses and agreed to meet the next morning. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, dwelling on Mark's sudden change in demeanor and the unsettling feeling I had when he invited me to his place. I did some digging online and found his address on a public records website. I looked it up on Google Maps, and it turned out to be a small, isolated house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods. Great. The next morning, I debated whether to go through with it. I even considered calling the police and asking them to accompany me. But I didn't have any concrete evidence of wrongdoing, just a bad feeling. In the end, I decided to go, but I took precautions. I told a close friend where I was going and asked her to call me every hour to check in. I also brought a can of pepper spray and kept my phone in my hand the whole time. When I arrived at Mark's house, I was even more nervous than before. The house was dilapidated and overgrown, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I parked my car on the street and walked up the long, uneven driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark was waiting for me on the porch, leaning against the railing. He gave me a creepy smile. "Glad you could make it," he said. I took a deep breath and followed him inside. It smelled like mildew and something else, something acrid and unsettling. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside. The furniture was old and broken, the walls were stained and grimy, and the air was thick with dust. Mark led me into a small, cluttered room that served as his office. There was a desk piled high with papers, a computer monitor, and a printer. He gestured for me to sit down, but I remained standing. "So," I said, trying to sound confident, "do you have the title and the paperwork ready to go?" He smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that sent shivers down my spine. "Almost," he said. "But first, I need you to do something for me." Okay, listen up because this isn't some campfire story. This is real, and it happened because I was dumb enough to trust Craigslist. I'm writing this so hopefully someone else doesn't make the same mistake. I was trying to sell a used camera lens. Nothing fancy, just a kit lens I wasn't using anymore. I posted it on Craigslist for a fair price, and within a few hours, I got a response. A guy named Mark emailed me, said he was really interested and wanted to meet up that evening. He seemed normal enough in the emails, good grammar, polite, asked all the right questions about the lens. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near my apartment, a busy place with lots of people around. Seemed safe enough, right? Wrong. Mark showed up about 10 minutes late. He was taller than I expected, maybe 6 feet 3 inches, with this intense stare that made me immediately uncomfortable. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a bulky jacket, even though it wasn't that cold out. I tried to brush off my initial gut feeling and chalk it up to nerves. Selling stuff to strangers is always a little weird. He barely said hello before grabbing the lens from me. He didn't even look at it closely. He just held it for a second, then stuffed it into his jacket pocket. That should have been my first clue, but I was already on edge and just wanted to get the transaction over with. "So," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you want to give it a try, make sure it works?" He just shook his head. "Nah, it's fine. I trust you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. It looked like the right amount, but the way he was handling it felt off, like he was trying to intimidate me. He started counting out the bills, slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving mine. The coffee shop was crowded, but suddenly it felt like we were the only two people there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. When he finished counting, he handed me the money. I took it, trying to avoid touching his hand. It was then that I noticed something was wrong. The money felt weird, stiff, almost like it wasn't real paper. I quickly glanced down and realized what it was. Counterfeit. Every single bill was fake. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "This money is fake." He just smirked. "What are you talking about? It's perfectly good money." "No, it's not," I insisted, holding up one of the bills. "It's obviously fake. Look at the texture, the print." He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I gave you the money. The deal is done. Don't cause a scene." I tried to pull my hand away, but he wouldn't let go. I started to panic. I looked around the coffee shop for help, but everyone was busy with their own conversations, oblivious to what was happening. "Let go of me," I said, my voice louder this time. He tightened his grip. "Just take the money and shut up," he snarled. I knew I had to do something. I took a deep breath and kicked him as hard as I could in the shin. He yelped and released my wrist. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the coffee shop as fast as I could, leaving the fake money and my camera lens behind. I didn't stop running until I was back in my apartment, safely behind locked doors. I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without a better description of the guy and without having the fake money as evidence. Basically, I was out of luck. I learned a hard lesson that day. Craigslist is not always a safe place to do business. There are scammers and dangerous people out there, and they're not afraid to take advantage of you. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Meet in a very public place. The coffee shop was busy, but it wasn't busy enough. Choose a place that's constantly bustling with people, like a police station parking lot. Seriously, some stations offer this as a safe meeting place for online transactions. Bring a friend. There's safety in numbers. Don't go alone. Inspect the money carefully. If you're accepting cash, take your time and make sure it's real. Use a counterfeit detection pen if you have one. Trust your gut. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Walk away. It's better to lose a sale than to put yourself in danger. Report suspicious activity. If you have a bad experience on Craigslist, report it to the site and to the police. I lost a camera lens and almost got into a really dangerous situation because I was trying to save a few bucks. It wasn't worth it. Please be careful out there. Craigslist can be useful, but it's also a breeding ground for creeps and criminals. Don't become another victim. Stay safe. I was moving across the country for a new job and needed to sell basically everything I owned. Furniture, kitchen stuff, clothes, the whole 9 yards. Craigslist seemed like the easiest, quickest way to do it. I mean, everyone uses Craigslist, right? I'd sold stuff on there before with no issues. I figured it would be a simple in and out, make a few bucks, and lighten the load for my big move. I was so wrong. It started innocently enough. I posted a bunch of ads with pictures and descriptions, trying to price everything competitively. Within hours, my inbox was flooded with responses. Mostly lowball offers and obvious scammers, but a few seemed legit. I sold a coffee table, a couple of lamps, no problem. Then I posted my queen-sized bed frame and mattress, a decent set that I'd bought only a couple of years earlier. That's when things got weird. I got an email from a guy named Mark. He said he was interested in the bed and could come pick it up that evening. He didn't haggle on the price, which should have been my first red flag. He just said, "I'll take it. What time works for you?" I gave him my address and said he could come by around 7 p.m. As soon as I hit send, I got this uneasy feeling. I couldn't explain it. Mark's email was polite, straightforward, but something about it just felt off. I shook it off, figuring I was just stressed about the move. Around 6:45 p.m., a truck pulled up outside my apartment building. It was an old, beat-up pickup, the kind you see on farms. A guy got out who fit the description I pictured, tall, lanky, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked up to my door and knocked. I opened it, trying to be friendly. "Hey, you must be Mark." He nodded, didn't smile. "You got the bed?" "Yeah, come on in." I led him inside, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. He was quiet, didn't make eye contact, just followed me into the bedroom. It's a queen size, like I said in the ad. Mattress and frame are both in good condition. I gestured towards the bed. He walked over and just stared at it for a long moment. Not like he was inspecting it, more like he was observing it. It was creepy. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "That'll do." Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully and placed it on the mattress. It was a photograph of me sleeping in my bed. I froze, unable to speak. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. How could he have a picture of me sleeping in my own bed? I hadn't given him my name, hadn't posted any pictures of myself in the ad. This was beyond creepy. This was terrifying. What the hell is this? I finally managed to stammer out, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the picture, then back at me, a strange, unsettling smile spreading across his face. "You didn't think I'd come unprepared, did you?" I didn't wait to find out what he meant by that. I turned and ran, bolting out of my apartment and into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath, dialing 911. The police arrived quickly. They searched my apartment, but Mark was gone. So was the picture. They dusted for fingerprints, took my statement, and told me they'd investigate. But honestly, they didn't seem to take it that seriously. Probably just a weirdo, one of the officers said. Craigslist is full of them. I couldn't stay in that apartment another night. I called my best friend, who lived nearby, and begged her to let me crash on her couch. I spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every sound, convinced that Mark was watching me. The police never found him. The case eventually went cold. I moved across the country as planned, but the experience left me scarred. I still have nightmares about that picture, about Mark's creepy smile, about the feeling of being watched. I learned a hard lesson about the dangers of the internet, about the anonymity it provides, and about the fact that sometimes the things you see on Craigslist are a lot more sinister than they appear. I'll never use Craigslist to sell anything again. The thought is enough to send chills down my spine. I still get night terrors over this incident. To know that someone had been in your apartment and took pictures of you in your sleep? This is a thought that haunts my dreams to this day. What happened next still haunts my dreams. It started with a damn futon. I was fresh out of a messy breakup, subletting a shoebox apartment, and desperately needed a place to sit that wasn't the floor. Craigslist seemed like the obvious solution. Futon, like new, $80, the ad read. The pictures looked decent enough, a simple black futon with a few throw pillows. The price was perfect for my pathetic budget, and the location was only a short drive away. I emailed the seller, Sarah, and we arranged a time to meet the next day. The address Sarah gave me led to a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the worst area, but it definitely had that lived-in and slightly forgotten vibe. I parked my car and walked towards the building, feeling a little apprehensive. The place just felt off, but I told myself I was being paranoid and that I just needed a damn futon. I found Sarah's apartment number and knocked. A young woman with tired eyes and messy blonde hair answered the door. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Hi, I'm here about the futon," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Oh, right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come in." The apartment was even worse than the building. It was dark, cluttered, and smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. Sarah led me to the living room, where the futon sat unfolded, taking up most of the space. It looked okay, just like the pictures. I sat down on it, testing the cushions. It was surprisingly comfortable. "So, is it what you were expecting?" Sarah asked, hovering nervously nearby. "Yeah, it's great," I said, pulling out my wallet. "I'll take it." As I counted out the money, I noticed Sarah was watching me intently, her eyes darting around the room. She seemed incredibly anxious. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "You seem a little on edge." "I just want to get rid of it," she said quickly. "It's been causing me bad luck." I chuckled. "Bad luck? It's just a futon." "No, you don't understand," she insisted, her voice rising. "Ever since I got it, things have been going wrong. My boyfriend left me, I lost my job, and I keep hearing noises at night." I frowned. "Noises? What kind of noises?" "Scraping," she whispered, "like something's dragging itself across the floor." I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but Sarah's intensity was unnerving. I paid her the money, and she practically shoved it into her pocket. "Can you take it now?" she asked. "Please." I told her I'd need to go get my car and come back to load it up. She practically leaped at the opportunity to get away from the furniture. "Great, I'll wait here." I practically ran to my car. As I drove back to the apartment complex, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sarah's behavior was bizarre, and her story about the futon being cursed was ridiculous. Yet, I couldn't dismiss the sense of dread that had settled over me. I debated just driving away and forgetting the whole thing, but I really needed that futon, and I had already paid for it. Stupid, I know. When I pulled up to the apartment, I saw Sarah standing outside, pacing back and forth. She looked even more frantic than before. "Hurry," she said as I got out of the car. "I want it gone now." I popped the trunk, and we started to drag the futon out of the apartment. It was heavier than I expected, and as we struggled to maneuver it through the narrow doorway, I noticed something odd. There was a dark stain on the underside of the futon, near one of the legs. It looked like dried blood. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to the stain. Sarah didn't answer. She just kept pulling, her face pale and sweating. We finally managed to get the futon into my trunk, and I slammed it shut. "Okay, I think that's everything," I said, eager to leave. Sarah nodded, not meeting my eye. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Get out of here." I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. The whole way back to my apartment, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced that someone or something was following me. When I finally arrived, I parked the car and stared at the futon in the trunk, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. I couldn't shake the image of that dark stain or Sarah's terrified face. I decided to leave the futon in my trunk overnight and deal with it in the morning. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the building sent shivers down my spine. I kept thinking about Sarah's story about the scraping noises, and I imagined something dragging itself across the floor towards my apartment. The next morning, I opened my trunk, ready to face the futon and get it out of my life. But when I looked inside, it was gone. The futon was simply not there. The trunk wasn't damaged, and nothing else was missing from my car. The futon had just vanished. I stood there for a long time, staring into the empty trunk, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I going crazy? I decided to drive back to Sarah's apartment to confront her. But when I arrived, the building was deserted. The windows were boarded up, and there was a notice on the door saying the building had been condemned. I never saw Sarah again, and I never found out what happened to the futon. But I'll never forget that experience. The fear, the paranoia, the sense of something sinister lurking just beneath the surface. And I'll definitely never buy anything from Craigslist again. My heart still races when I remember all that. It was just a futon. I hope